All right, Aaron Tabacco, thank you for being on the show. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Sam. It's always really good to connect with you. So I appreciate the invitation.
Yeah, I'll say for listeners, I had the great pleasure during my intensive with Berkeley, the 10 days, 8 hours a day of just straight coaching, practicum and learning. Man, it's so intense. But I got to meet Aaron there and learn from him as well as learn about myself just from feedback that he gave me. And it's been a wonderful relationship that we've built over the last number of months since then. But Aaron, let me open the floor to you. Tell us your story about who you are and how you came to be involved with Berkeley Executive Coaching Institute.
Yeah, thank you for that invitation. So I came to Berkeley a little over 3 years ago ish, something like that. I serve as the director of staff experience for the Department of Medicine at the University of California, San Francisco. And I have a very large department with a number of leaders. We have about 1,100 staff, a similar number of faculty, and then pretty close to that number of trainees, residents and medical fellows. And of course, in that work, I have a pretty big portfolio that has a lot to do with leadership development, organizational development, cultural stewardship. And I'm sort of a one person shop. And yeah, I was really just very curious to see what certifying these skills that I had developed over a very, very long period of time would do in translating my former background even more fittingly into this role. So, for context, I have been a professor of nursing for many years in developmental pediatrics and family nursing, research methodologies, just a number of areas in which my scholarship and teaching and clinical practice rotated around. And it was about 5 years ago that I needed to go on a little journey, like many of us do, as we're in that, between 40 and 50-year-old period of deciding what I wanted to do next. The step that made most sense in my career would have been to move into a deanship somewhere. And I was decidedly uninterested in that. So
Okay, all right.
yeah, I thought, oh, okay. I think what I'd really like to do is just continue to distill down all of the things that I love and continue filtering out the things about my work I didn't. But that meant translating what seemed like a very specific context to my skills into the larger business world. It took a good year for me to figure that out. But then I landed in this position, generally speaking, in a learning and organizational development or consultant role. The fit was excellent. And that's what brought me to Berkeley. I just thought, this certifying my coaching work, which is something, of course, I've done for years in many contexts with junior faculty and graduate students and undergraduate students and et cetera. But I felt like certifying those in some way would allow the business people to see and make sense of that a little, maybe a little more than seeing a PhD and an RN. If they would
Mm,
see executive coach, they would go, oh, I know what that is.
sure.
So, yeah, I did a big search, consulted with people in the executive coaching world that I trusted and knew. And Berkeley's name came up and interviewed with them to just see what they were like. And it was clearly a good fit. So I did my program there, and then upon completion was invited to join the faculty. So I have really, really loved that.
Wow. Tell me more about the career long experience that you've had developing others and how the the curriculum and the skills that you got certified in through Berkeley aided in that. And more specifically, let me ask, how do you distinguish between mentorship and coaching, and how do those
Mm-hmm,
play off each other?
mm-hmm. Well, let's go to that first part. It's interesting. People look at my career journey across all these years and they think, oh gosh, this is a very nonlinear journey. I grew up in a very working class family, and a primary area of that for one side of my family was in restaurants. And so when I left high school and was trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life, I just continued doing work I grew up doing because it felt really safe to me. And I seemed to have a bit of a knack for working with people. So I started managing restaurants for other people and then quickly realized, there are opportunities that I could take to develop my own businesses. And I did. So for that first real sort of adult decade of my 20s, I built a restaurant group from the ground up with no capital. I don't know exactly how I did
Wow.
that, but I did, and spent a good decade, as a business owner, and of course, just that's a very narrow margined, high effort world to be in. As comfortable as it was, I was also raising a family. I had two small children at the time, and a third would eventually arrive. And I was completely burnt out before even turning 30, and realized, I wasn't even seeing my children awake for like 2 or 3 days at a time, some weeks. And that was not compatible with who I am. That just wasn't resonating with my values. So I did a deep journey to decide, where would I be able to capture the things I really loved about that work and have a very different lifestyle and a different sort of financial landscape. And that's kind of what, to spare a very long story, moved me into nursing,
Mm.
which people said, well, that seems like a big change. But when you really think about nursing and restaurant work, there's actually a lot of overlapping Venn diagram territory there.
Huh.
But really, what I loved as a business owner was taking care of the people who showed up to be in my restaurants, my customers, developing deep relationships with them, hearing all their stories. I mean, it is really true. If you stand behind a bar, you're going to hear a lot of stories of people. And
Mm.
that was certainly true for me. But also just developing my own people. And that was something I'd had quite an affinity for, was sort of training. And I thought maybe early on I'd become a corporate trainer. Maybe that would be my pathway. But alas, I just kind of kept distilling and distilling until I've arrived at where I am now. And so when I really look at the big arc, I don't even see it as a nonlinear sort of river of life kind of an approach. I just see it as this constant distillation of who I am as a person into more sort of pure forms of my highest possible contributions to the world. So I think, yeah, that's kind of, what that journey looks like. And then this next question you asked, how do I distinguish between mentoring and coaching? I have to say, I really appreciated Berkeley for,
Mm.
sharing some models around that. I feel that I've certainly occupied both of those roles and other roles, advisor or consultant as well, et cetera. I think for me, coaching can be a very long term investment in another individual that might look sort of mentorship like in some ways. But I really feel that for me, a coaching situation or relationship is much more about joining someone in curiosity and exploration. And the mentorship piece is more about formation or professional comportment. It's about not just being present for someone in curiosity, but helping them really actively put that into work. Can be more directive at times, can be more educational at times. There can also be some elements of sponsorship in there, where part of it, a mentor's job is to bring that other individual into their larger sphere of practice or community. And that might not necessarily happen in a coaching engagement or relationship. So I think it's just a little bit about uh, on the mentorship side, really about that comportment or formation, really bringing that person into possession of that role that they're taking on that you're helping them with.
Wow, that's so good. Thank you for sharing that.
Oh, you're welcome.
Let me ask, what is the kind of work that you're doing most right now, and how does that relate to the presentation you'll be giving in November at the coaches conference in Berkeley?
Well, right now, internal to my role, it's increasingly being populated by leadership and executive coaching work on a very one-on-one or cohort basis. So we just have leaders who really have a lot of need for support, as you can imagine, in healthcare. The last several years, particularly in medicine and nursing, those are areas where people have been just really sort of traumatized and very hard hit over quite a long period of time. And the administrative aspect of making all that happen has been sort of equally challenging. So I have worked to really shift my internal practice of coaching to be much more hands-on with that, doing a lot more program delivery around leadership concepts and helping our leaders consider new ways of being and inhabiting their roles. On my private practice, of course, that is also focused more broadly. I definitely work with some folks in the healthcare world, but generally speaking, I work with executives across sectors and industries. But a lot of the sort of topical focus right now seems to center on disconnection, people feeling really disconnected with themselves, with others, with their own futures and their paths, struggling with certain degrees of uncertainty or lacks of clarity about different aspects of their values and their future, and maybe just a general sense of malaise or burnout. Lots and lots of burnout coaching, and that really leads to a deep focus on energy management with people. So topically, that's kind of the landscape. How does that relate to my Berkeley talk? I think that the energy management piece probably ties in nicely, though this year, this will be the second time I presented at the conference in the last few years. This is a little departure. My first talk I kind of did a couple years ago really focused on the practice of presence, presence at a really high level, and in particular in really highly emotive sessions. So coaches who are dealing with that individual who shows up and completely breaks down about something. That was just something coming out of kind of the community. There was a lot of discussion about, oh gosh, how do you really deal with that when someone's expressing such a high degree of emotion? And as you can imagine, a former nurse and a professor of nursing teaching nurses, I have a lot to say about that, and being with people in very, very life changing, life upsetting moments and circumstances. And so it seemed really natural to bring that forward and enjoy that. Though over the last couple of years, for some reason, the question I keep seeing pop up here and there in our Berkeley community forums and et cetera has been around the topic of ADHD. So working with leaders who self-identify as having attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And strangely enough, all of those years in clinical practice, that's my most focal area of specialty. And it's very, very lifespan oriented, because when you deal with children with ADHD, there's about a 65% chance that there is also a parent in the home with ADHD. And so I decided, well, maybe I can contribute to the community by sort of addressing that topic and bringing that clinical expert lens a little bit into the coaching realm to set people up maybe for more success with engagements around this topic and serving people in the population who live with ADHD. And so energy management, I think, is a really big tie-in there.
Mm.
A lot of folks who experience ADHD really sort of struggle with energy management. Energy is either too high or too low, out of context for a need or situation, or there's just a lot of energy and it's really difficult to sort of channel and focus it. And of course, a coach wants to be helpful, but does not want to be doing for the other individual in the
Right.
relationship. So we tend to not want to, and rightly so, step into a space of that should be occupied either by a therapist or by an executive assistant.
Hmm.
It is not our role to jump in and help people figure out how to time manage on a granular level, or to be prepared for every single task that happens in their days. That's a little bit too high touch, I think, for what the coaching role should be. So my job this fall will be to kind of enlighten folks about the wiring of the ADHD brain and the lived experience of persons with ADHD, and all of that from a very strong perspective of neurodiversity, which is a core value for me.
Hmm.
The seeing of this as an innate human variance that is wonderful and amazing, and brings with it, a lot of possibility, but while simultaneously recognizing the struggle that individuals with ADHD experience in just trying to fit into a society that is sort of the antithesis of what their gifts and needs are.
Hmm. Why is neurodiversity a core value of yours?
Well, I think for many, many reasons, and very, very personal reasons, I literally would not be living today had we lived in a society that was not at least open to accepting and celebrating neurodiversity. And what I mean by that is there was an experience I had as a young child of about, oh gosh, I think I must have been 7 or 8 years old. Let's see. Yeah, maybe 8 or 9. But regardless, my younger sister was hosting a birthday party. It was a pool party, and we had booked out a hotel pool so that it could be private and sort of contained. And for some strange reason, I mean, it's the 70s, so there's that. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
my parents, as they were going back and forth to kind of get things set up, and all these kids were arriving and want to jump into this pool, sort of left me in charge of that group. And while I knew how to swim, these little kindergarten type kids, who knew? And what did I know? I mean, I know how to swim, but I don't know anything about rescue and lifeguarding, any of that. And of course, some kid was like, "Oh, I know exactly what I'm doing," and jumps into the deep end of this pool and immediately panics because he can't reach bottom. And I panic because I don't know what else to do. So I jump in, and not knowing anything about how to rescue somebody, I got caught in the undertow in the wake, and had literally just begun passing out when I felt arms around me pulling me to the side of the pool and out. And after a pretty significant recovery period, learned that this incredible young woman with Down syndrome, who had been a silver medal winner in Special Olympics swimming events, happened to be in that pool area and watching, and saw what was happening, and
Wow.
jumped to our aid. And that, of course, stood with me as like, wow, this person who I was then interacting with in the recovery, post recovery period, and was probably one of my first substantive experiences with a person with Down syndrome, or really any major sort of neurodiversity diagnosis. Uh, so it made a really deep impression on me. And so, and I raised 3 sons with ADHD. That was no
Mm.
accident that became my
Mm.
clinical and research specialty. Um, but to me, this was years before the word neurodiversity was really born and cultivated out of the autism community. as a way of saying, please don't try and change who we are. We don't, we're not the problem. The rest of you all in society is the problem. We
Mm,
are just fine as who we are and in our uniqueness. And I think when you think about diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, especially the belonging piece, which means so much to me as a very high empathy person, that we should all be able to feel as though we belong. It's a very natural leap to say, oh, yeah, that represents my core values as well, around that. So as a clinician, my whole goal has never been to sort of change anyone or to necessarily pathologize them for their differently wired brain, but really to help them find a pathway of belonging and a feeling of deep personal satisfaction and success in the world. And you can't really accomplish that, I think, if you don't have a neurodiversity mindset.
hmm. Thinking, first of all, thank you for sharing that story. That's incredible,
Thank you.
harrowing. I'll share personally, yeah, I was diagnosed with ADHD when I was about 7 or 8. And my mom as well, around that time. She didn't know, being a child of the 70s. She didn't know. Her parents just thought she's just a crazy kid. And that's not an uncommon experience, I suppose, but less
Right.
so now. I am curious to know, when we talk about belonging, and we're obviously talking about this in the context of executive coaching. I've often heard stories and seen examples of, say, high achieving people who try to outperform or achieve past and race away from who they are in some ways. What about presence and being a a trained and knowledgeable coach, and being in a coaching relationship with such an overachieving person, do you think is useful for us to know about or consider?
Well, I think you bring up something sort of interesting, and I probably would begin with the definition of sort of, well, what is overachieving? What is achieving versus overachieving? And so I kind of would take from your words there that maybe you're sitting with a hypothetical client who is experiencing some degree of stress or burnout or dissatisfaction because of this sort of need to perform at maybe not even just a high level, but higher than everybody else kind of a level. And it's very interesting because I've really benefited over the years from a number of different thought leaders in the world of thinking and writing, speaking. And Pema Chodron is an author, an American Buddhist nun, if that's the right language, who has written a number of books about this very thing. The things that we do to sort of self-medicate or dampen or ignore these deeper voices inside of us that are telling us, hey, we're suffering in some way. And I often look at the behaviors of really extremely driven people as a potential clue that there's something deeper internally that leads them to a behavior that might be worth exploring. And I think it does come back to presence of self. In this case, it's the presence, being able to offer presence to oneself to see what's really going on there. That can be incredibly valuable. I mean, we can't really even talk about being fully present for other people. So if that highly driven, overachieving person is also getting feedback from all of the relationships in their personal and work life that you're not very present for me, then that's
Mm,
sort of like the ticket. If they're showing up in my office or on my Zoom call saying, I'm getting all this feedback that, I just need to be more present for people. And I just don't really know how to do that because I'm all about the outcome and the KPI and the deadline. I don't have time for that, or I'm not really good at that, or I don't know how to do that. We have to really back up to say, oh, well, let's start with being present for yourself,
Mm.
right? Because you have to have been able to be present for yourself before you can extend that elsewhere. And it sounds like in that situation, it's kind of one of those hypotheticals where something deep is going on there that needs to be listened to. And maybe my job as a coach is to help them tune in and listen to whatever that is. I don't know what it is, but somewhere inside them they do. And opening a space for that and creating a deeply trusting relationship where they can be safe enough to stop and pause and say, oh, right. What do I learn when I'm present for myself? Is sort of the beginning often of that work.
It's very interesting. I think often there's a idea, a sort of unspoken definition of what a mentor can look like, or often does. And it's something like the person who has the life I want or is on the career path that I want that's 15, 20 years ahead. And so I ask for their advice. They tell me what they would do in my situation. And then they go on doing what they do. The difference between a mentor and a coach, perhaps, is what you had mentioned, where a coach understands the answer isn't inside me. It's not necessarily in my experience. I may offer that as a point of connection or contrast for the sake of conversation, but the answer is within the coachee. Speak more to what that means to have a relationship or have a conversation where we know the answer is already inside that person.
Yeah, what's so interesting is people do really get frustrated right with that, and I can certainly relate to that, even from my own experiences. I feel stuck, I feel unclear, I feel uncertain, and I feel that somewhere out there is an answer, and I can't figure out what that answer is. And so, if someone were to sit down with me and say, "Oh, well, you already know the answer to this; it's just inside of you," it honestly makes me really frustrated. I'm like, that's not helping.
Yeah.
Like, like
Just tell
clearly
me
I
what to
don't
do.
know the answer. Why am I paying for you to be here? Or why am I, investing time to ask you about this? But I think what I've learned about inhabiting this coaching role is that the shift to make isn't even about unlocking the answer. It's having somebody to offer the right question, or not even just the right question, different questions than we're asking, right? I think we get stuck because we have all of this. First, we have a story we're telling. We don't realize it's a story. We don't realize there are assumptions. We don't realize that we have put barriers or some sort of perimeter around all of it, all of the situation, ourselves, the future, the possibilities. So we're stuck in this world of story. We keep asking ourselves the same unproductive questions. Why me? Why did this happen to me? Why can't I figure this out? Why won't this work? Why can't I take this path? And kind of get into this circular thinking about it. But the coach, I think a really good coach can show up and simply ask us questions that we've not thought to ask, that illuminate the barriers we've falsely put up, right? Or the definitions that don't apply, or really just the story we're telling that might not be the only story. But could there be a different story, a different way of telling that story? Yeah, I think that's kind of the key there. Is it's less about the answers that are within us and really more about the questions that are within us. And are we using questions that open us to possibility or confine us to
Mm.
possibility? And that's where the coach, I feel, really does bring value. And I love it. I love when I'm in a session or observing a session or seeing a new learner coach, or an extremely adept, sort of very senior, very expert coach who just asks a question that makes everyone's go, "Oh, I did, I did not even think to ask that." But that's the question that opens up mobility, possibility. And I mean, I do come from a discipline that's very like that. Nursing is
Mm,
grounded in that kind of practice, so it is something that I pull into my practice all the time. It is not a new thing for me. It's definitely a sort of an old way of thinking about things that's deeply ingrained in me. But I love seeing it in the context of coaching, and I'm constantly, thinking about just the beauty of questions.
mm.
Yeah.
As I've studied and developed myself as a professional, I dive into a lot of psychology and topics that interest me. One thing I learned from some books that I've read is often some of these authors that I've come across, essayists, they are speaking from a different life stage than me. They're speaking as being 60s, 70s, just later on in life. And so sometimes the reference points they talk about are things that I haven't yet experienced. For instance, they talk about midlife crisis or
Right.
transitioning into retirement, that those kind of life experiences. And it was always interesting to me to take what they were talking about and see how does that apply to me? Where am I at? And what kind of life transitions are coming up for me? When earlier you had mentioned that part of your journey towards Berkeley and executive coaching included a time in your life where you had to make some decisions, you had to have some conversations with yourself. What type of questions came up for you that helped you through that process of change?
Well, yeah, that period of just even changing careers at 30, 31, whatever that was. Interestingly enough, that wasn't even the biggest crisis I had faced in my life. I had no idea that I was about 8 years shy of an even bigger one.
Oh, wow.
I was like, whoa. So I definitely have some experience with that. I'll speak to the wisdom of, that I grew and gained through sort of blood, sweat, and tears from that second period. And I think really what I would offer is that the questions I started asking myself really were sort of life defining, almost life or death questions. Like, are you willing, Aaron, to live even another day in this degree of suffering? Right?
Wow.
Are you willing to sacrifice your health, your family, your life, your relationships, even your purpose in life to hold on to this suffering that, or this fear rather, that doesn't even serve you? Right? So really deep existential philosophical questions, you know, external questions offered by other people. Very interestingly enough, I remember being, just as I was describing, very stuck in a story that I didn't feel had any way out. And just no, like the only possibilities, all the only two possibilities I saw were both unsustainable, destructive pathways forward. And a really good coaching question that came to me was a little bit of a leading conversation, which we try to avoid.
We try not to lead. Yeah, yeah. But
But
this is
I
you.
do have to say, it was really vital. And of course, this person wasn't a coach. This person was a mental health professional. And so was coming at this from a different angle. But it does highlight the power of an open-ended question that really can give you illumination. And in the midst of a conversation where I just was kind of stuck in that place and that sort of hopelessness of, gosh, there's only these two paths, and I'm frozen, and I can't process anymore about this. I just don't know what to do. And he dialed me back and said, well, let's pause for a little bit of time. Catch me up on what you're doing professionally. I know that in your doctoral work, you were studying, families and resilience and children with special healthcare needs, and like, what's going on with you in that area? And so I talked a little bit about that and just kind of caught him up professionally just to kind of lower my overall emotional activation and get my brain moving again. And Nate was great. He cued right in on what I was saying. And he was like, so what is all of the scientific literature right now? I mean, you've been doing this research yourself. Like did this big research study for my dissertation on fathers raising children with ADHD. He's like, what are the characteristics of a resilient family? And it's great. I immediately felt like, oh, so something I can talk about with expertise and clarity, and gave that, I'm sure, this nice little, like, what would have been like a 5-minute poster talk at a scientific conference about, the top 10 characteristics of resilience in families. And then this is where that sort of curiosity of openness in the right moment really helped, because he just followed it up with, well, that's really powerful. What are the characteristics of your family? And
Hmm.
right there, I was like, oh my God, my family's totally resilient. We have all of these characteristics. And that then opened like this whole new world of possibility where I could not have seen any. Like, I really was stuck, right? What do I do with my life and my family and all of these choices in front of me? And that was the thing that just created this little motion in a system that was just completely frozen. If you think like of a machine, the engine is all
Mm.
locked up and those
Yeah.
pistons cannot fire, they cannot move. And it was like it didn't make the engine purr, but it put just enough motion that things could get started for me. And I think that's kind of an example of what I mean by that, bringing forward this deep introspective look in partnership with somebody and asking a profound open-ended question in just the right moment can help them see beyond their limits. And that was, of course, like I said, that was a therapeutic conversation, not a coaching conversation. But the question would have been just as valid in a coaching conversation offered by a coach. What are the characteristics of your family? I don't know. I don't know your family. Tell me more about them, in the context of what you just shared. So, yeah, I think that's kind of what I strive for in my coaching practice, is just to be so present as to hear what is spoken and what is being unspoken, and to speak the unspeakable by simply asking a very open question.
Hmm. I appreciate that.
Yeah, you're
I'll
welcome.
share that my mom, once all of us kids were in school full time, she went back to school and she's been a nurse working in the
Yay.
NICU for I can't even remember how many years now, but it's absolutely her calling, and it is totally draining on her working nights, but she loves serving her patients, her
Yeah.
little preemies and all that. I send her some memes every now and again as I come across them. There was one instance where there was a needlepoint cushion on a couch that said, instead of it saying "In God we trust," it said "In evidence-based practice we trust."
I love that.
And so I see a contrast in how you have grown and operate within a medical context. How and perhaps maybe a lot of us think of coaching generally as being a lot looser in the way it's done and the methodologies. How do you combine those things, or how do you bridge the gap between someone who maybe is skeptical of coaching?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I mean, that was one of the things I had to deal with deciding, why would I do this? I mean, I can see how it would benefit me, but I come from, I mean, I literally am a scientist. I have a PhD. I have done many research studies over many years and applied a lot of different, methodologies, et cetera. And of course, I work in an area where scientific knowledge is sort of vital. You need to
Right.
really understand what is happening. And so looking at something like coaching, I thought, oh, that just feels kind of loosey goosey and
Mm.
kind of. I mean, ultimately, it is a non-regulated practice, and in that, there's no law really around this per se, in nationally or internationally, or even from a state perspective here in the U.S. So, what does that really mean? I mean, anybody could just literally put out a sign and say, I am a coach, I'm a health coach, I'm a leader coach, I'm a whatever coach. So I really did look really carefully at knowing that there is sometimes a lack of scientific approach to generating knowledge about coaching. Not that it isn't out there, because it is, it's scant, but it's out there. What's the next level that I want to, of sort of rigor that I want to apply to a situation? And I thought, well, for me, that has to do with sort of theory and frameworks. What sort of theoretical practice frameworks, and then on the ends of those pieces, what experiential learning practices are tied to a program that to me would look like it was sensible and rigorous. That did, I mean, Berkeley certainly qualified because I obviously looked deeply at that and ended up choosing that. But where I ended up having to kind of look was more in the realm of, frameworks.
Mm.
And the frameworks that Berkeley uses as part of its curriculum really resonated with me. This had to do much more with where I was and where I have grown to at this point in my career and in my lifespan, which is I'm not as interested in doing at all. What I'm really interested in is being.
Mm.
How are you choosing to experience being in the world? Leaders always show up at the doorstep and they're like, I have a problem with doing this. We have to get this done. How do I have this conversation? What are the 10 things I need to do to give this person feedback and have it be received and, like legally correct and all of these things? I'm like, doing, 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 doing. But I'm like, being precedes doing.
Mm.
Being is deeper than doing. What sort of frameworks would be useful in helping someone dive deeper into the heart and meaning of their life journey as a person inhabiting whatever role it is they're showing up to talk about? Their leadership role, their C-suite role, their new role, whatever it is, to pull them back into a space of examining their being, how they choose to show up and then choose to be present for people. How does their personal spiritual journey toward authenticity relate to the way they're showing up in the world? Do they actually feel free enough to be themselves or not? Like, those deep questions are actually, I feel, the questions that solve most of the problems that they experience when it comes to the doing of their work. So for me, talking about that and getting back to what you were saying, how do you kind of bring rigor or assurance to somebody who might be skeptical about coaching? I guess my response is, be skeptical. Ask questions.
Mm.
What is your training? What are the frameworks that you use to approach things? And ask yourself, where is the most growth possible with this potential coach? If their training is more about a specific way of doing, and that's what you need, then by all means go for it. But if what you're feeling is that, anybody can teach me doing, that could be a mentor, that could be, a teacher, it could be, I could take a class in that, whatever. But if you want to dive deeper into ways of being, those pieces that really drive the doing for you, then look for a coach who can articulate what those pieces are. I mean, I can look right at it and say, I had these frameworks specifically from Berkeley, and I bring all of these other specific frameworks to my work from all of the rest of my background, which is obviously really deep, right? So Yeah, I guess that's kind of my approach to it is like, yeah, there isn't this abundance of scientific evidence in lots of ways about coaching practices. There is some, but what's the next level you can look at? And it's basically theory guided practice, right? And theory guided practice is absolutely valuable and legitimate. And
Mm,
it'd be wonderful to see more sort of scientific or rigorous exploration of those pieces. But I'm sort of past a place in my career where I want to do that work. But I'd be really happy
sure.
to encourage other people to do it for sure.
Well, let that be known. Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
I think it is wonderful to hear that advice, that to meet the person where they are. If they're skeptical, be okay with that and invite curiosity and exploration to see what is it that they need, what is it that they want. And
Hmm.
I see that often it just comes down to I want to turn the unknowns about what coaching might be into feeling that I can trust what the process looks like for me.
Yeah.
And that's the real transformation people are looking for.
Yeah. Well, in that trust piece, I mean, one of our shared frameworks, something you and I, talk about is part of Berkeley's work, but much broader than that. I mean, this is work has been around forever, and that's work out of the book publication of that is the trusted advisor. But Maester Green and Galford's work around trying to actually rigorously study what trust is. So that, I mean, that's something I can point to say, well,
Mm,
they've actually done quite a bit of work around this model of trust that emerged from their data and their exploration as scholars. And so, what you're talking about there is that credibility piece, right? Like,
mm,
what are we showing up? What are we showing up with in terms of preparation, experience, and knowledge? And how are we willing to show up and be present for somebody with that knowledge? That's the credibility aspect.
mm.
So that you're tapping into that there, and I think that if people are skeptical, that's what they're looking for, right? Is well, what's the credibility factor here?
Yeah,
So I think it does have a pretty good tie into, these other pieces that we were just talking about.
definitely. Aaron, as we conclude, one thing I ask every guest, since this is the Courage Coach for Executives podcast, what does courage mean to you?
Well, I think to me, I would say, and I'm just going to speak from my own lived experience, I feel that I don't always feel that I'm courageous when other people say, gosh, that was really courageous. Right. So I think people often look at like, that seems like that took a lot of strength or whatever it is, some sort of X factor to show up and do a thing that even in the moment I'm like, well, I don't feel that was courageous at all. It maybe it just felt necessary or it felt logical. So I loved your question and I appreciated seeing that ahead of time this morning because it made me think, well, what does courage mean to me? And what I ended up on is sort of an active definition. To me, I think courage means curiosity in the face of resistance,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
That could be very passive courage, the courage to be curious about your own thoughts when you're experiencing internal resistance to them. Like just the silent thought, am I really just a terrible person? Or is maybe my thinking skewed? Is there even a possibility? Is there even a possibility that I might be an okay person, right? That's sort of this passive courage. It's not this grand gesture out in the world, but it's being curious when you feel resistance. And on the very active side of that spectrum, I can say the things I've done that have, I think, most outwardly looked courageous were exactly the same thing. It was like I have all this resistance within me and outside of me saying, don't do this thing. It's going to result in all kinds of bad stuff. But internally, being willing to embrace the curiosity to just say, well, I don't know what's going to happen, but I must take this step forward. I must be curious about what's going to go next because everything in me is in alignment when I choose to do this thing. So I'm just going to be very actively curious about it. So I think that's it. Curiosity in the face of resistance.
Wow. I love that. And I think a common thread that has come up in this conversation is the fact that sometimes others can see the good in us better than we can see it ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so important to have those relationships where we can have that awareness given
Yeah.
to us.
Yeah.
So thank you, Aaron, for being on the show.
You're welcome, Sam.
I'm Sam, the courage coach for executives. And remember, it starts with you.